now we're going to be looking at script communication. Script communication in Unity is one of the most essential parts of creating games. You're never going to have just one script that can do it all. You're going to have several scripts throughout your game. Some AAA studio games, some even large indie titles will have hundreds of scripts that have to be able to talk to each other and communicate to create a feature or have some sort of gameplay ability. So what we want to be able to do here is, as of right now, when there's a collision that happens with the power-up can print out the name of the object it collided with. But really what we want it to do is access the player, and then once it accesses the player, we need to say turn the triple shot bool to true. And then at the end of it, we need to destroy ourselves. So how does script communication work? Script communication works using what's called getComponent. So let's go ahead and look at the scripting reference for getComponent. Go ahead and type in getComponent. Component.getComponent returns the component of type if the game object has one attached, null if it doesn't. Now let's go ahead and look at an example of this. Here they have a hinge joint. This is just a data type, or a class, it's a class type called hinge joint. And they named it hinge. This is just a variable name, it could be named anything. And they're basically saying equals getComponent hinge joint. And then once they have that component, they can access the properties that are part of the hinge joint class. Another example of this would be, for instance, our player. Imagine this was the player class that we created. And then we could name the variable anything we want, maybe lowercase p, just p, and then we could say equals getComponent the player. And then from there we could be able to access player dot, and we would get all the public information that's available to us. So for example, the way this works is there's two parts to script communication. You need a handle to the component. You need a handle to the component, then you can access the component. All right, and really that's really the only thing you need, is you just need a handle to the component. So let's go ahead and create a handle to the component we want. So for this example, what is the component we want? We want the player, right? So we're going to go ahead and say player, which is the class name, and then we can just name it whatever we want. We can name it lowercase player. We can name this Bob. It doesn't matter. It's just a variable name that's going to store the player. So let's go ahead and call it player. Now we need to assign this to a component, similar to how it was done in the scripting reference, where they take that and they assign it using the equal sign to the component we want. So we say getComponent, these are called T brackets, and then the class name. Now the component we want is the player script, because that player script has a variable called can triple shot, and we want to turn that to true. So how can we go about getting that? Well, we need to first access the object that we collide with, which is stored in other. From there, we can grab a component that we want. When you're working with script communication, you have to go in a very hierarchy order. Think of how we grab the X position of our transform for the player. Can I grab the X value just by typing X? No. I first have to go to the transform, then the position, then the X. It's kind of the same thing when working with getComponent on our power-up. I first need to get a reference to the player, so I need to find the player. Now once I've found the player, I can get a component, and I can get a list of these components. I can get the transform, the sprite renderer, the player, the box collider 2D, or the rigid body 2D. I want the player component. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the player using other. That gets the game object, and then I can type getComponent. So I'm getting the component of my choosing off of whoever collided with us. And what I want to do here is I'm going to type player. That's the component I'm looking for. And then I initialize it with open, close parentheses. And don't forget your semicolon. Now I have access to every public variable, or anything that's public I have access to from this player variable. What's important here is that this type, player, matches what's inside the T brackets here. These two types must match. So for instance, this says player player. This cannot say transform. They must match and be identical. Okay, so now that we have a reference to our player, let's go ahead and access our variable. We're going to say player dot triple shot bool equals true. So from the power up script, we just set our player's can triple shot variable to true. Now check this out. I was able to see that public variable. However, what if I wanted to access the fire rate? Could I do that? If we go ahead and try that, if I type player.fire rate, you're going to notice that there's no auto completion for fire rate. And the reason for that is because it's a private variable. So private variables can only be accessed through the script itself. However, public variables can be accessed by other scripts. So we go ahead and say player.canTripleShot equals true. And last but not least, we want to destroy ourselves. And we talked about how to destroy. So as soon as we enable our triple shot, we'll say destroy this.gameObject. Okay, so we access the player. We enable triple shot and destroy ourselves. Whoops. Destroy ourselves. Okay. Let's go ahead and save this and test it out and see what we got. So we'll go ahead, clear that. All right, go back to the game, run it. And you'll see here, we just collected it. And if you look on the player, can triple shot is true. So let's go ahead and try that again. All right, and you'll notice here that can triple shot is false. And as soon as I collect it, it now becomes true. So we just created a pickup item. Pretty cool, right? So what we want to do now is check that we are interacting with the player. For instance, what if two power-ups were to collide with each other? There's no distinction of checking if it's the player. This here will return null if the component that we're looking for doesn't exist. However, it will error out here because we're accessing a component that doesn't exist, and we're trying to get a hold of that variable. So what we want to do is check to see if other is the player. So just like we can get other.name to check if it's the player, we could just check for that. You know, we could say here, if other.name is player. So here we're comparing a string to a string. So if other.name equals player, and then we can go ahead and toss this code inside of there. All right, this would work perfectly fine. The only downside here is what happens if we accidentally rename our player to, what if we accidentally rename our player to something else, or if it's a lowercase p? So this is where tags come in. Tags allow us to identify game objects. So for instance, this player here, we can give it a tag of player by default. And when we create our enemy, we'll look into creating our own tags later. So let's go ahead and add a tag of player. So select your player, tag, and make sure player is checked. Now what we can do is in the PowerUp script, we can check to see if other.tag is equal to this player. And if the player is tagged as player, then all of this code will function. If not, it will be ignored. So for instance, later in our game, if an enemy were to hit this PowerUp, nothing would happen. So that's exactly what we want. And if we test this out one more time, we'll see that we should be pretty good. And there we go. We have our triple shot. In the next video, we'll look at creating a cooldown system to disable the triple shot after X amount of seconds. There is one more thing I want to demonstrate when using getComponent, and that's null checking. So the documentation says that when we do this, if the component we're looking to get doesn't exist, it's going to return null. And like I mentioned before, it would error out here saying null reference exception, object reference not set to an instance of an object, or something along those lines, because we're accessing the player. However, it wasn't found up here. So typically after creating your handle, you want to check if that handle is null or not. You want to check to see if we actually found that component, and then you want to perform whatever operation it is you want to do. So here we would just simply say if player is not equal to null, meaning that we did find that component, then we'll go ahead and enable the triple shot. Otherwise, you'll be calling a variable and changing the value of it when you never had access to the player script to begin with, and that will cause your game to error out and essentially crash in a real build. So you always want to do what's called null checking when working with getComponent.